Carter's bedroom door creaked open at 6:14 on a Saturday morning, the soft sound pulling Julian Matthews from the shallow sleep he'd learned to navigate over 4 years of single fatherhood. The bed beneath him felt too large, the king-sized mattress a geography of absence he'd mapped every night since Sarah died. He slept on the right side, always the right side, leaving the left untouched as though preserving space for a ghost who never came back. The small figure appeared at his bedside, gap-toothed and serious in dinosaur pajamas that had been washed so many times the T-Rex on the front had faded to a friendly suggestion of its former self. Carter Matthews, at 6 years old, possessed the unsettling ability to look both like a child and like someone much older, as though grief had added layers to him that shouldn't exist in someone who still believed in the tooth fairy. Julian blinked against the early light filtering through curtains that Sarah had chosen during a Saturday afternoon trip to Home Depot 3 months before her diagnosis. She'd insisted on blackout fabric because Julian worked late and needed to sleep in on weekends. The irony of that decision, her consideration for a future she wouldn't see, had stopped hurting quite so much, though it never stopped entirely. Carter stood perfectly still, studying the bed with the intensity he usually reserved for the star charts that covered his bedroom walls. His expression carried a weight that made Julian's chest tighten with the familiar cocktail of love and inadequacy that defined his fatherhood now. The question arrived without preamble, delivered in that matter-of-fact tone children used when asking about the fundamental architecture of the universe. "Daddy, is your bed big enough for 2 people?" Julian pushed himself up against the headboard, the sheets cool where no one else had disturbed them. Sleep evaporated as his mind scrambled to decode the question, to understand what had prompted it at this particular moment on this particular morning. "What, buddy?" Carter climbed onto the bed uninvited, settling cross-legged at the foot like a therapist preparing for a difficult session. His small hands twisted the hem of his pajama shirt, a nervous habit he'd developed after Sarah's funeral when the social worker had explained that Mommy wasn't coming home from the hospital. "Jake's parents share a bed. I saw when I slept over last week. They were both in it, together." The observation landed with the weight of an accusation, though Carter's face held only curiosity. Julian reached out and pulled his son close, breathing in the scent of the strawberry shampoo Miriam Foster had bought because she remembered Sarah always kept it in the bathroom cabinet. "You sleep on one side, Daddy, just one side. Is the other side broken?" Julian felt something crack open in his chest, a fissure that had been sealed with routine and responsibility and the sheer forward momentum of keeping a 6-year-old alive and healthy and loved. He wrapped his arms around Carter and held on, feeling the steady thump of his son's heart against his ribs, that beautiful, fragile heart that Dr. Reeves monitored every 3 months because of the congenital defect that had been Sarah's last discovery about their child before the cancer stole her capacity to care about anything except surviving one more day. "No, Star, it's not broken, it's just waiting." Carter pulled back enough to meet his eyes, and Julian saw Sarah in the shape of his son's face, in the way one eyebrow lifted slightly higher than the other when he was processing complex information. Waiting for what? Julian had no answer that wouldn't be a lie or a hope he couldn't promise to fulfill. He smoothed Carter's sleep-mussed hair and manufactured a smile that probably didn't reach his eyes because his son was too perceptive to fool and too kind to call him on it. "I don't know yet, buddy, but I'm figuring it out." Carter accepted this with a slow nod, then scrambled off the bed with the sudden energy shift that characterized childhood. At the doorway, he paused and looked back with an expression Julian couldn't quite read. "Mommy told me something. In a dream last week." Julian's hands stilled on the comforter. Carter rarely talked about Sarah anymore, as though mentioning her might somehow make her more gone than she already was. When he did speak of her, it was usually to ask practical questions about whether she would have liked his art project or approved of his dinner choices. "What did she say, Star?" She said her bed in heaven is big enough for her and all her love for us. And your bed needs to be big enough for someone who makes you smile the way she used to. The words hit like physical force, stealing air from the room. Julian opened his mouth to respond, to explain that adults didn't receive instructions from dreams, that love didn't work on a simple replacement model, that the logistics of moving forward were more complicated than bedroom furniture arrangements. But his throat had closed around whatever platitudes he might have offered, and tears he hadn't cried in 18 months blurred his vision. Carter padded across the room and climbed back onto the bed, this time settling against Julian's side with the casual affection of someone who had learned to recognize grief and had decided not to fear it. "It's okay to cry, Daddy. You taught me that after Mommy left for the stars." Julian pulled his son close and let himself break down for the first time since the night he'd packed away Sarah's clothes, finally accepting that she wasn't coming back to need them. Carter's small hand patted his shoulder, with the kind of comfort that should have flowed in the opposite direction, but somehow worked anyway. When the tears subsided, Julian wiped his face on the sheet and found Carter watching him with those two old eyes that understood more about loss than any child should. "I miss her, buddy. Every single day." "Me too. But missing her doesn't mean we can't love someone new. Love multiplies, Daddy. It doesn't divide." Julian stared at his 6-year-old son, wondering when exactly he'd become the student in this relationship, and Carter had assumed the role of teacher. The wisdom felt borrowed from somewhere beyond childhood, as though Sarah herself had whispered these truths into their son's dreams and Carter was simply delivering messages from the other side of grief. "Where'd you learn that?" Carter shrugged with the casual certainty of someone who didn't question the source of his knowledge. "Mommy told me, in the dream. She said you needed to know." They sat together in the slowly brightening room, two people learning to live in a space shaped by absence, and Julian wondered if his son was right, if maybe the bed wasn't broken at all, just waiting for something neither of them had names for yet. The alarm on Julian's phone shattered the moment at 5:45, 15 minutes late, because he'd forgotten to reset it after Carter's visit. He scrambled out of bed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had choreographed single parenthood into a series of timed movements designed to get a small child fed, medicated, and ready for whatever the day required. The kitchen smelled like the coffee he'd programmed the night before, one of the small victories that made mornings manageable. He pulled Carter's medication from the cabinet, the digoxin that kept his son's heart beating in steady rhythm rather than the dangerous arrhythmia that had nearly killed him at 18 months. The pill was tiny, designed for children, and Julian crushed it into applesauce the way Dr. Reeves had demonstrated 4 years ago when they'd first started this routine. Carter appeared at the table already dressed, another small miracle that Julian had learned not to question. His son had developed a fierce independence born from necessity, understanding without being told that mornings required cooperation because Daddy had to get to work and there was no one else to pick up the slack. The drawing supplies had already been spread across the kitchen table, Carter's current project taking shape in careful crayon strokes. Julian set down the applesauce and watched as his son added details to a figure floating among stars. Sarah with her arms outstretched, her smile captured in the way only a child who'd loved her could remember. "You got her smile perfect, Carter. She'd love this." Carter studied his work with the critical eye of an artist, then added another star in purple crayon. "This one's for her eyes. Purple was her favorite color." Julian's hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee mug, memory ambushing him with the precision of a sniper. Sarah wearing that purple sundress on their first date, Sarah in purple scrubs during her residency, Sarah in the purple headscarf she'd chosen when her hair fell out in clumps from the chemotherapy that ultimately failed to save her life. The flashback lasted only seconds. Sarah in the hospital bed, her frame so diminished she barely made an impression under the white sheets. Her voice reduced to a whisper as she gripped his hand. with surprising strength and said the words that had carved themselves into his bones. "Take care of our star, Jules. Promise me." He'd promised. Of course he'd promised. And he'd spent every day since trying to keep that promise while pretending he wasn't drowning in the responsibility of it. Carter finished the drawing and pushed it across the table, offering it with the casual generosity of someone who created beauty without fully understanding its value. Julian accepted it carefully, adding it to the collection that covered the refrigerator door in a gallery of grief and healing and a 6-year-old's understanding of the universe. They moved through breakfast with practiced coordination, Carter eating his fortified cereal while Julian checked the weather and confirmed that Miriam would be available to babysit that evening. The system they'd built over 4 years functioned with the precision of a machine, each piece fitting into the next because failure wasn't an option when you were raising a child alone. Morrison and Fletcher occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Portland, the kind of building designed to project success through architecture and intimidate through sheer vertical ambition. Julian had worked there for 9 years, starting as a junior analyst and working his way to senior status through the combination of genuine talent and the workaholic tendencies that grief had amplified into something approaching obsession. His desk sat in a corner with a view of the Willamette River, a location he'd earned through competence rather than politics. The other analysts respected him for his ability to find patterns in data that others missed, to translate numbers into narratives that executives could understand and act upon. He was good at his job. Sometimes it was the only thing he was certain about. The quarterly report for Holloway Biomed sat on his monitor when he arrived at 7:30, the spreadsheet cells glowing with the familiar architecture of financial data. Julian had been reviewing the pharmaceutical company's accounts for 6 months, part of Morrison and Fletcher's contract to provide independent analysis of their research and development investments. The discrepancy appeared in column 7, row 43, a $2 million irregularity that should have balanced against corresponding entries in the capital expenditure account, but instead vanished into a category labeled miscellaneous operational costs. Julian ran the numbers 3 times, checking his formulas and cross-referencing against previous quarters, but the conclusion remained unchanged. Someone at Holloway Biomed had moved $2 million through a shell category, disguising it well enough that a cursory review would miss it entirely. But Julian Matthews didn't do cursory reviews. He did thorough, obsessive, borderline excessive analysis because numbers didn't lie and patterns told stories, and his job was to listen. Liam Harper appeared at his desk at 9:15 carrying coffee and the expression of someone about to deliver news that wouldn't be well received. The regional director had hired Julian 6 years ago, promoted him twice, and developed the habit of treating him like a younger brother who needed both guidance and the occasional reality check. "Good catch on the Holloway account." Julian swiveled his chair to face his boss, noting the tension in Liam's shoulders that suggested this conversation wasn't going to end with praise and a raise. "There's a problem, a significant one. I've documented everything in the report." Liam set down his coffee and crossed his arms, the body language of someone preparing to draw a boundary. "I saw, and I need you to stop digging." The words arrived without preamble, delivered in the tone of someone who'd already made a decision and was simply informing subordinates of the outcome. Julian felt something cold settle in his stomach, the first whisper of recognition that this wasn't going to be a straightforward discussion about financial irregularities. "If there's fraud, we have an obligation to report it. That's literally in our contract. And we will report it through proper channels. After I've had a chance to discuss it with Holloway's CFO and understand the context, you don't just accuse a client of embezzlement without exhausting every other possibility first." Julian studied his boss, searching for the calculation behind the careful diplomacy. Holloway Biomed represented 40% of Morrison and Fletcher's annual revenue, a fact that everyone in the building understood but rarely discussed openly. Losing that account would mean layoffs, restructuring, possibly the end of their Portland office entirely. What other possibility explains $2 million vanishing into a miscellaneous category? Liam's expression hardened, the shift from collegial to authoritative happening in the space between heartbeats. That's not your call to make, Matthews. Your job is to flag irregularities. My job is to determine how we handle them. Don't be a hero about this. The word hero landed like an insult, suggesting that integrity was a performance rather than a principle. Julian felt his jaw tighten, the familiar stubbornness that Sarah had loved and occasionally despaired of rising to the surface. I'm not trying to be a hero, I'm trying to do my job correctly. Then do it by following the chain of command. I'll handle Holloway. You move on to the next account. Liam walked away before Julian could respond, leaving behind his half-finished coffee and the unmistakable message that some truths were less important than client relationships. Julian stared at the spreadsheet on his monitor, at the $2 million that had been carefully hidden by someone who understood how to manipulate financial reports, and felt the weight of a choice he hadn't asked to make. He filed his report anyway, documenting everything with the thoroughness that had made him good at his job. If Liam wanted to bury it, that was Liam's decision to live with. But Julian Matthews wouldn't be the one who pretended not to see the problem. The bank balance stared back at him from his phone screen during lunch, the number smaller than it should be and larger than it had been 6 months ago. $847 in checking, another $6,000 in savings that was supposed to be Carter's college fund, but had been slowly depleted by medical expenses that insurance didn't quite cover. The cardiology bill sat unopened in his messenger bag, $1,200 for last month's follow-up appointment where Dr. Reeves had used words like progression and intervention timeline and surgical consultation. Julian had learned to translate medical euphemism into plain truth. Carter's heart defect was getting worse, and the surgery they'd been monitoring for years was becoming less optional and more inevitable. The preliminary estimate from the cardiac center had arrived 3 weeks ago, delivered in a manila envelope that Julian had opened with hands that shook slightly. $85,000. Insurance would cover 60% if they met all the pre-authorization requirements and stayed within network, and Carter didn't develop complications that pushed him into experimental treatment categories. Julian had spent an entire evening running scenarios, building spreadsheets that modeled every possible financial outcome. In the best case, he'd need to come up with $34,000. In the worst case, significantly more. The savings account currently held $6,000. His salary was $72,000 a year before taxes, enough to live on but not enough to accumulate the kind of money that cardiac surgery required. He'd picked up extra hours consulting for smaller firms, sacrificing sleep to build the financial cushion that might mean the difference between Carter getting the surgery at the optimal time versus waiting until it became an emergency. The mathematics of it were brutal and simple. Time equaled money equaled his son's survival. Miriam Foster knocked on his apartment door at 5:30 with a casserole dish that smelled like the comfort food Sarah used to make before she got too sick to cook. The neighbor had appointed herself as de facto grandmother to Carter, filling a role that Julian's actual mother couldn't manage from 3,000 miles away in Boston. "Mijo, you look exhausted." Julian accepted the dish and gestured her inside, noting the concern in her expression that suggested she saw more than he wanted to reveal. Miriam had been married to Thomas Foster for 43 years before lung cancer took him, had nursed him through the final 6 months with the kind of fierce devotion that Julian recognized in his own memories. She understood grief from the inside, which made her difficult to lie to. "Carter's cardiology appointment is next week. I'm just running numbers." Miriam followed him into the kitchen and began unpacking the groceries she'd also brought, a habit she'd developed over the years that Julian had stopped protesting because pride was exhausting and she was genuinely helping. "The surgery? Dr. Reeves thinks we're looking at a 6-month window. Sooner if Carter's symptoms progress faster than expected. The older woman paused in the middle of putting away vegetables, her hands stilling on a bag of carrots. When she turned to face him, her expression carried the weight of someone preparing to say something that needed to be said regardless of how it would be received. Sarah would want you to find happiness again, Julian. Not just survive, actually live. The observation arrived sideways, catching him off guard with its presumption of understanding what his dead wife would have wanted. He busied himself with setting the table, needing the activity to avoid having to respond immediately. I'm living. Carter and I are doing fine. You're performing survival with remarkable efficiency. That's not the same thing. Julian set down the plates harder than necessary, the clatter filling the small kitchen with sound that substituted for the response he couldn't quite articulate. Miriam had no right to judge his choices, to suggest that the life he'd built was somehow insufficient because it didn't include room for romance or companionship or whatever she was implying. Except she did have the right. She'd earned it by showing up every week with food and childcare and the kind of practical support that kept his household functioning. She'd earned it by loving Carter like a grandson and never asking for anything in return. Except that Julian occasionally accepted help without making it a battle about independence. I'm not ready. The admission came out quieter than intended, stripped of the defensiveness that usually armored his refusal to discuss his personal life. Miriam crossed the kitchen and pulled him into a hug that smelled like lavender and flour and everything safe about childhood. Sarah wouldn't want you to be ready, she'd want you to try anyway. They stood together in the kitchen while Carter played in his room, and Julian wondered if maybe his neighbor was right, if maybe the closest full of clothes he couldn't quite bring himself to donate, and the side of the bed he couldn't bring himself to occupy were less about honoring Sarah's memory, and more about being too afraid to risk loving someone who might also leave. The invitation from Morrison and Fletcher's Human Resources Department arrived via email at 4:30 on a Thursday, the subject line proclaiming Winter Gala, attendance mandatory for senior staff. Julian stared at the message with the kind of dread usually reserved for dental appointments and parent-teacher conferences that started with the phrase, "We need to discuss Carter's behavior." He hadn't attended a social event since Sarah's funeral, hadn't worn the suit that hung in his closet gathering dust for 4 years, hadn't voluntarily put himself in a room full of colleagues making small talk about things that didn't matter. The thought of it made his skin itch with anticipated discomfort. But mandatory meant mandatory, and senior analyst meant he couldn't hide behind the excuse of being too junior to require attendance. He responded with a brief confirmation and tried not to calculate how many hours of overtime he'd need to work to offset the cost of a babysitter who could handle Carter's medication schedule. Miriam solved that problem by volunteering before he could even ask, showing up at his apartment on Saturday evening with a stack of children's books and the kind of unflappable competence that made Julian wonder what he'd done to deserve such reliable support. Go. Have conversations with adults who don't ask about the structural integrity of the solar system. Maybe even smile at someone. Julian checked Carter's medication one more time, confirmed the emergency numbers on the refrigerator, and kissed his sea goodnight with the guilty relief of someone escaping a beloved prison. The suit felt wrong on his body, the fabric too tight across shoulders that had gained muscle from carrying a growing child, the tie a noose he'd forgotten how to knot properly until YouTube reminded him. Sarah had bought this suit 7 years ago for a conference in Seattle, insisting that he needed to look professional even though he'd argued that data analysts were judged by their work, not their wardrobe. She'd been right, as usual, and he'd worn it to 3 client presentations before wearing it to her funeral. The memories clung to the fabric like cologne, making every adjustment of the collar a reminder of her hands smoothing it down, her voice telling him he cleaned up nice for a numbers geek. The Grand Portland Hotel had been decorated with the kind of tasteful excess that corporate budgets allowed when impressing clients mattered more than fiscal restraint. String lights transformed the ballroom into something approaching magical, though Julian's analytical mind immediately began calculating the electrical load and wondering if the fire marshal had signed off on this many open flames in a confined space. He accepted a champagne flute from a passing server and positioned himself near the dessert table, a strategic location that offered both sustenance and the illusion of purposeful activity. Other analysts clustered in familiar groups, discussing projects and office politics with the casual fluency of people who saw each other every day and still found things to talk about. Julian sipped his champagne and felt profoundly alone in a room full of colleagues he respected but didn't particularly like. This was the cost of being good at his job while remaining fundamentally private about everything else. Professional success purchased through social isolation. The woman appeared at the dessert table at 7:43, her arrival causing a subtle shift in the room's energy that Julian noticed before he consciously registered her presence. She wore an emerald gown that suggested both elegance and deliberate armor, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders in a style that seemed unusual only because Julian's brain insisted on cataloging her as someone who typically wore it pulled back. Grace Holloway. He recognized her from the business news coverage of her father's death 4 years ago, from the profile in Portland Monthly that had focused on her unlikely ascent to CEO at 32. From the quarterly reports he'd reviewed that bore her signature on the final page. She was supposed to be intimidating. The articles all described her as brilliant and ruthless and fundamentally unknowable, someone who ran a billion-dollar pharmaceutical company, with the kind of precision that didn't leave room for weakness or sentiment. But standing 3 feet away, selecting pastries with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb, she looked tired and slightly lost and nothing like the Ice Queen reputation suggested. Julian watched her reject 4 different desserts before selecting a chocolate torte, and something about the indecision made him speak before his social anxiety could stop him. The lemon tart is better. Less pretentious chocolate ratio. She turned to face him with an expression that suggested surprise at being addressed by someone who wasn't an executive or a board member. Up close, her eyes were hazel and lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from too many late nights and not enough reasons to go home. You look like you're calculating exit trajectories. The observation was accurate enough to startle him into honesty. Occupational hazard. I'm an analyst. I see patterns everywhere. Grace Holloway set down her plate and studied him with the intensity of someone conducting an evaluation, her gaze cataloging details he couldn't quite interpret. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted from polite curiosity to something approaching genuine interest. What pattern do you see here? Julian glanced around the ballroom, at the clusters of people performing enthusiasm with varying degrees of success, at the executives working the room with practiced efficiency, at the support staff who'd been invited but knew they didn't truly belong. 200 people performing happiness, maybe 5 actually feeling it. The laugh that escaped her was real, unguarded, the sound of someone who'd forgotten they were capable of genuine amusement. She picked up her plate again and moved closer, the proximity suggesting she'd made some decision about him that Julian hadn't consciously registered earning. Which category are you in? The here because HR said so category. I like honesty. It's rare. They stood together at the dessert table while the string quartet played something classical and forgettable. 2 people who'd stumbled into a conversation neither had planned, but both seemed reluctant to end. Julian found himself noticing details, the way she held her champagne flute without drinking from it, the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested the dress was armor after all, the absence of a wedding ring on her left hand. Grace asked about the ring on his hand, the simple gold band that he'd never quite managed to remove, even though Sarah had been dead for 4 years. The question was direct enough to bypass his usual deflections, delivered with the kind of clinical precision that suggested she already knew the answer and was simply confirming her analysis. Widower, 4 years. Cancer. My son Carter asks why I still wear it. Her expression shifted, some of the armor dropping away to reveal the vulnerability underneath. What do you tell him? That some loves don't end just because the person does. Grace's hand trembled slightly as she set down her champagne, and Julian watched tears she refused to let fall gather at the corners of her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something that felt like confession. My father died when I was 12. Heart attack. Mid-sentence in a board meeting. I took over his company at 32 because I couldn't let it die, too. The parallel struck him with uncomfortable force. Two people shaped by loss into versions of themselves that prioritize survival over living, competence over connection, the performance of success over the messy reality of grief. He understood her in a way that felt invasive, as though her confession had granted him access to truths she didn't typically share. So you're in the performing happiness category. I'm in the forgot what happiness feels like category. The string quartet transitioned into a waltz, and couples drifted toward the dance floor with the coordination of people who'd attended enough corporate events to know the rhythm. Grace watched them with an expression Julian couldn't quite decode. Something between longing and terror and the kind of calculation that preceded risky decisions. When she turned back to him, her chin had lifted in challenge. Dance with me. Julian felt panic claw at his throat, memories of Sarah flooding back with visceral intensity. The last time he'd danced had been in their living room at 2 in the morning when she could barely stand, when her body had been ravaged by disease, but her determination to create one more memory had outweighed her physical limitations. I haven't danced since her, I know. Dance with me anyway, not to replace the memory, to honor it. The logic was flawed, but somehow compelling, and Julian found himself taking her offered hand before his brain could construct adequate reasons to refuse. Grace Holloway led him onto the dance floor with more confidence than he felt, her hand settling on his shoulder with the lightness of someone trying not to presume too much. They swayed more than danced, neither of them particularly skilled at this kind of choreographed intimacy. Julian kept waiting for his grief to overwhelm him, for the comparison to Sarah to make this unbearable, but instead he found himself existing in the moment with surprising ease. Grace's perfume smelled nothing like Sarah's. Her height was different, her presence entirely her own. This wasn't replacement, it was just a dance with someone who understood loss from the inside. Sarah loved to dance. Last time was 2 in the morning in our living room. She weighed 89 pounds and could barely stand. But she smiled the whole time. Grace didn't offer platitudes or apologies or any of the empty phrases people usually deployed when confronted with other people's grief. She just tightened her grip on his hand slightly and continued moving to music that barely registered. She sounds like she was extraordinary. She was. Carter has her smile. They finished the dance in silence, and when the song ended, Grace didn't immediately release his hand. They stood together on the edge of the dance floor while other couples continued their choreographed movements. Two people who'd found unexpected recognition in each other's carefully maintained facades. Does Carter like science? I saw his name on your phone background. The drawing? Julian pulled out his phone and showed her the sketch that currently served as his wallpaper. Carter's careful rendering of the solar system with planets labeled in his messy 6-year-old handwriting. Grace studied it with an intensity that suggested genuine interest rather than polite performance. He's obsessed with space, constellations, planets, the whole universe. I volunteer at Portland Children's Museum. Science Saturdays. Would he want to come? You too, of course. The offer arrived casually, but Julian heard the vulnerability underneath it. The risk of extending invitation to people who might reject her. His first instinct was to refuse, to maintain the careful boundaries that kept his life manageable and his heart protected. But Carter's question from that morning echoed in his mind, is your bed big enough for 2 people? And he found himself considering possibilities he'd actively avoided for 4 years. I appreciate the offer, Ms. Holloway, but I don't need charity. Her expression shifted, the armor dropping away entirely to reveal something raw and honest and utterly without pretense. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute sincerity. I'm not offering charity, Mr. Matthews. I'm asking if you'd teach me what it's like to be around people who aren't performing. I'll pay for materials, but the time, that's what I need. Julian studied her face, searching for the manipulation or ulterior motive that his experience with executives suggested must be there. But Grace Holloway looked back at him with transparent need, and he found himself believing that maybe loneliness came in many forms, including the kind that expensive clothes and corporate success couldn't quite disguise. Saturday, 2 p.m., Portland Science Museum, but I'm paying my own admission. The smile that transformed her face was worth the risk of whatever complications might follow. Grace pulled out her phone and they exchanged numbers with the slightly awkward formality of people who'd skipped several steps in the normal progression of acquaintance. Deal. Julian drove home through streets still decorated with Christmas lights from the holidays that had ended 2 weeks ago, his mind replaying the evening in fragments that didn't quite assemble into a coherent narrative. He'd gone to a corporate gala out of obligation and somehow left with plans to introduce his son to a woman he barely knew but felt like he understood on some fundamental level. Carter was asleep when he arrived, sprawled across Miriam's lap on the couch with the abandon of childhood. Julian paid her triple the usual rate over her protests and carried his son upstairs, tucking him into bed with the mechanical precision of routine. In his own bedroom, Julian stood at the window and looked out at the Portland skyline, at the lights of a city full of people living their separate lives. The bed behind him felt too large and too empty and exactly the right size for someone still learning how to exist in a world without Sarah. His phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number that resolved into Grace's contact once he opened it. Thank you for tonight. I haven't felt like a person instead of a position in longer than I care to admit. See you Saturday. Julian typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on something simple that didn't require him to examine too closely what he was feeling. Thank you for the dance. Saturday it is. He set the phone on the nightstand next to Sarah's photo and lay down on his side of the bed, the right side, the only side he'd occupied since the night she died. Tomorrow Carter would probably ask more questions about whether the bed was big enough for 2 people. Tomorrow Julian would have to figure out how to explain that maybe it was, but that discovering that truth required more courage than he was certain he possessed. Tonight he closed his eyes and let himself remember dancing with 2 different women in 2 different contexts and wondered if maybe his son was right. If maybe love didn't divide at all. If maybe it multiplied in ways that honored what came before while making space for what might come next. The Portland Children's Museum occupied a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, its industrial bones softened by primary colors and the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that educational institutions deployed to make learning feel like play. Julian arrived 15 minutes early on Saturday with Carter practically vibrating with anticipation. The solar system model kit he'd insisted on bringing clutched against his chest like a talisman. Grace stood near the entrance wearing jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Julian's monthly grocery budget, but managed to look casual anyway. She'd pulled her hair back in a ponytail, and without the corporate armor she appeared younger and significantly more nervous than someone running a billion-dollar company had any right to be. Carter spotted her before Julian could orchestrate introductions, his 6-year-old social awareness operating on a wavelength that bypassed adult hesitation entirely. Are you the sad lady? Grace's expression flickered between confusion and something approaching alarm as Carter approached with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned that some observations were better left unspoken. Julian moved to intervene, but his son had already reached into his backpack and produced a folded piece of paper. The drawing showed Grace's face rendered in the careful detail that Carter applied to his astronomical subjects. But something was wrong with the eyes. They'd been colored in carefully but somehow remained empty, the smile on the face stopping at the mouth without reaching the gaze above it. "How did you know it was me?" Carter studied her with the intensity he usually reserved for telescope observations, his small hands holding the drawing between them like evidence. "You smile with your mouth but not your eyes. Daddy taught me to see that after Mommy left for the stars. It means someone's pretending to be happy but really they're sad inside." Julian watched Grace's composure crack, tears gathering at the corners of those hazel eyes that his son had rendered with uncomfortable accuracy. She knelt down to Carter's level, the movement bringing her face even with his, and when she spoke, her voice carried the tremor of someone whose defenses had been breached by the most unexpected weapon. "Your daddy taught you to be very observant. He says seeing true things is more important than seeing nice things. Are you sad?" Grace glanced up at Julian as though requesting permission for honesty, and he gave a slight nod because lying to Carter had never worked and starting now seemed like poor strategy. She turned back to his son and delivered truth with the kind of careful precision that suggested she wasn't used to sharing it. "I am sad sometimes. I've been sad for a long time, since my daddy died when I was a little older than you." Carter absorbed this information with the seriousness of someone processing complex data, then reached out and patted her shoulder with the awkward comfort of a child who'd learned that sometimes physical contact mattered more than words. "It's okay to be sad. Daddy cries sometimes too. He thinks I don't know, but I hear him at night when he looks at pictures of Mommy." Julian felt his throat close around whatever response he might have offered, the casual exposure of his grief landing with the force of public humiliation. He thought he'd been careful, thought he'd managed to contain his mourning to times when Carter was safely asleep. Apparently 6-year-olds were more perceptive than he'd given them credit for. Grace stood and met his gaze with an expression that combined sympathy and recognition. Two people who'd been caught performing competence when the reality underneath was significantly messier. "Your son is remarkably perceptive. He sees what adults hide. It's both his superpower and my constant source of anxiety." They moved into the museum with Carter leading the way, his excitement at the prospect of building a solar system overriding any lingering concern about making adults uncomfortable with his observations. The science education wing had been set up with workstations, each equipped with the materials needed to construct scaled models of planetary systems. Grace had purchased enough supplies for 3 complete projects, the excess suggesting either enthusiasm or uncertainty about what would be required. Carter claimed the station nearest the window and immediately began organizing materials with the methodical precision he'd inherited from Julian's analytical tendencies. The next 3 hours unfolded with surprising ease, Carter explaining astronomical concepts with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every episode of Cosmos and half the children's books in the Portland library system. Grace listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions that demonstrated she was actually paying attention rather than performing engagement. Julian found himself observing from slightly outside the interaction, watching his son and this woman build a solar system while discussing the loneliness of Mars and the crowded chaos of Saturn's moons. Carter's comparison of Mars to Grace had been unconscious, but Grace seemed to recognize the parallel, her responses carrying layers of self-awareness that suggested she understood exactly what his son was saying beneath the astronomical metaphors. "Mars is cold and lonely even though it's right next to other planets, like Miss Grace." Grace's hands stilled on the foam sphere she'd been painting red, her expression shifting through several emotions too quickly for Julian to catalog. When she looked at Carter, vulnerability had replaced the careful control she'd maintained at the gala. "I'm not lonely, I'm busy." Carter tilted his head with the skepticism of someone who'd heard similar deflections from his father and wasn't buying them this time either. His voice carried the absolute certainty of childhood when he delivered his verdict. "Busy is what lonely people call it, so they don't have to say they're lonely." The observation landed like a physical blow, and Julian watched Grace's composure fracture completely. Tears spilled over despite her obvious attempt to maintain control, and she turned away from the workstation as though distance might somehow preserve her dignity. Carter climbed down from his stool and approached her with the same deliberate care he'd shown earlier, his small hand finding hers with gentle insistence. "It's okay to cry too. Daddy says tears are just feelings that are too big to keep inside." Grace pulled Carter into a hug that looked like she was holding on to keep from drowning, and Julian felt something shift in his chest. Some wall he'd built around the possibility of connection beginning to develop cracks. This woman wasn't performing sympathy for his son. She was genuinely moved by a 6-year-old's wisdom, genuinely grateful for the permission to be vulnerable that Carter had extended without hesitation. When she finally released him, Grace wiped her face with the back of her hand and offered Carter a smile that actually reached her eyes this time. "Thank you for seeing me. The real me." They finished the solar system models with lighter conversation, and when the museum announced closing time, Carter lobbied aggressively for dinner together. Julian started to decline out of habit, but Grace's expression stopped him. Something between hope and terror that suggested this mattered more than casual social obligation. "Can I take you both to dinner? There's a bistro nearby that makes excellent—" Julian's response came automatically, the defense mechanism he'd developed over years of politely refusing help. "I pay my own way, Grace. It's about dignity." The words hung between them, harsher than he'd intended, and he watched her process the implicit rejection. But instead of withdrawing or taking offense, Grace straightened her shoulders and met his challenge head-on. "Then let's split it. Partners." The word carried weight beyond its simple definition, suggesting an equality that Julian hadn't experienced in his interactions with people who existed in Grace's economic stratosphere. He considered the offer, weighing his pride against Carter's hopeful expression, and his own unexpected desire to extend whatever this was beyond a single afternoon. "Okay, but nothing fancy. Carter likes pizza." "Pizza sounds perfect." The restaurant Grace chose occupied a corner lot in the Alberta Arts District, the kind of place that locals defended fiercely against transplants and tourists. Exposed brick walls displayed work from neighborhood artists, and the smell of wood-fired pizza competed with garlic and fresh basil for atmospheric dominance. Carter ordered for himself with the independence that always made Julian simultaneously proud and slightly sad, evidence of how much his son had been forced to grow up in the absence of a mother's presence. Grace watched this interaction with fascination, as though witnessing some exotic ritual she'd only heard about but never seen performed. They shared a large margarita, and Carter dominated the conversation with enthusiasm, explaining the finer points of planetary formation while simultaneously picking all the basil off his slices. Julian found himself relaxing into the rhythm of it, the strange domesticity of sharing a meal with someone who wasn't family but somehow felt less like a stranger with each passing hour. Halfway through dinner, Carter fell asleep mid-sentence, his head dropping onto Grace's shoulder with the casual trust of a child who'd decided she was safe. Julian moved to extract him, but Grace shook her head slightly, her hand coming up to steady Carter's sleeping form with surprising tenderness. "Let him rest. He's had a big day." They sat together in the dimming restaurant while servers began preparing for the dinner rush, and Julian studied Grace's profile as she gazed down at his sleeping son. The fierce competence that had built a pharmaceutical empire had softened into something gentler, and he found himself wondering what had happened to make her forget how to be this version of herself. "Can I see you both again, next Saturday?" Julian felt the question as both invitation and test, Grace asking for something while simultaneously preparing for rejection. Every instinct trained by 4 years of protective isolation screamed at him to refuse, to maintain the boundaries that kept his life manageable and his heart safe from additional loss. But Carter's words from that morning echoed louder. "Is your bed big enough for 2 people?" And Julian heard himself answering before caution could intervene. Why? You're a billionaire CEO. Grace interrupted with unexpected fierceness, her free hand finding his across the table. You're real. Everyone in my life wants something. You just want to protect your son. That's refreshing. Julian needed her to understand that this couldn't be curiosity or charity or some wealthy person's experiment in experiencing how normal people lived. He pulled his hand back and delivered the boundary that mattered most. Grace, I need you to understand something. I have dignity. I can't be your charity case or your experience real people project. If you come back, it has to be because you want to, not because you're curious. Her expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked like determination mixed with vulnerability. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. Say that again. What? That you have dignity. Say it so I remember what that sounds like. The request was strange enough to catch him off guard, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with being seen completely. Julian held her gaze and repeated the words with deliberate emphasis. I have dignity. I deserve respect. My son deserves someone who wants to be here, not someone performing kindness. Grace leaned across the table and pressed her lips to his cheek. The contact brief but charged with meaning that Julian couldn't quite parse. When she pulled back, tears were sliding down her face again, but her smile had finally learned to reach her eyes. I want to be here, Julian. Teach me how. The 8 weeks that followed developed their own rhythm, a pattern of Saturdays and occasional weekday evenings that gradually wove Grace into the fabric of Julian's carefully ordered life. She attended Carter's soccer practice and brought healthy snacks that the other parents eyed with a mixture of admiration and territorial suspicion. She sat with Julian during Carter's cardiology appointment, her hand finding his when Dr. Reeves delivered the news that surgery would be needed within 4 months rather than 6. Julian's apartment filled with evidence of her presence, a coffee mug she preferred, a jacket forgotten on the back of a chair, children's books she'd bought for Carter that reflected her determination to understand his interests. The progression felt simultaneously too fast and inevitable, as though they were catching up to a relationship that had been developing in parallel before they'd consciously acknowledged it. Grace cooked dinner at his place on a Wednesday evening and managed to burn pasta in a pot of boiling water, a feat that should have been impossible but somehow matched her complete lack of domestic competence. They ordered takeout instead, and Carter declared it the best dinner ever, cementing Grace's status as someone who made mistakes without shame and therefore could be trusted. The financial pressure of Carter's upcoming surgery sat like weight in Julian's chest, the numbers running through his head at odd moments when he should have been focused on other things. His savings account had grown to $14,000 through aggressive overtime and consulting work that left him exhausted but closer to the goal that might save his son's life. Grace never offered money, and Julian was grateful for that restraint, understanding that she recognized the line he'd drawn and was respecting it even when her resources could have solved his problems with casual ease. The distance between their economic realities created tension that neither acknowledged but both navigated carefully. By week 7, they'd settled into something that felt like courtship from another era, the slow building of intimacy through shared time rather than physical escalation. They kissed on week 8, standing in Julian's kitchen after Carter had gone to bed, the contact tentative and weighted with all the complications they were choosing to ignore. Carter drew a picture in week 8 that he presented at breakfast with the pride of someone who'd captured essential truth. Julian, Grace, and himself arranged in a family portrait with Sarah rendered in stars above them. The arrangement suggested acceptance without replacement, and Julian taped it to the refrigerator next to all the other evidence of his son's artistic documentation of their evolving reality. Miriam met Grace in week 6 and delivered her approval through the subtle nod she gave Julian when Grace wasn't looking, the neighbor's blessing carrying weight that his actual family's opinion couldn't match from 3,000 miles away. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday in the form of an emergency board meeting at Holloway Biomed that Julian only learned about through the financial news alert on his phone. Grace had texted that morning to cancel their dinner plans with apologies but no explanation, and watching the market analysts speculate about instability in the company's leadership made Julian's analyst brain start assembling patterns he didn't particularly want to see. The call from Liam Harper came at 4:30, summoning Julian to his office with the tone that preceded uncomfortable conversations. Julian saved his work and made the walk across Morrison and Fletcher's 14th floor with growing certainty that whatever was about to happen, he wasn't going to like it. Liam's office overlooked the Willamette River, the view purchased through decades of political navigation and strategic alliance building that Julian had never possessed the temperament for. His boss sat behind a desk that looked designed to intimidate, and the expression on his face suggested he was about to deploy all available authority. "We need to discuss your relationship with Grace Holloway." Julian felt something cold settle in his stomach, the recognition that his personal life and professional obligations were about to collide in ways he'd been carefully avoiding thinking about. He sat down without being invited and met his boss's gaze with the directness that had sometimes helped and sometimes hurt his career advancement. "What about it?" "Holloway Biomed's board has requested that you be removed from their account. Conflict of interest concerns given your relationship with their CEO." The words landed with clinical precision, stripping away the careful separation Julian had maintained between the work he did analyzing Holloway's finances and the time he spent with Grace outside of professional contexts. He'd flagged irregularities in their accounts months before meeting her, had maintained his analytical integrity even as their personal relationship developed. "I flagged the discrepancy in February, 2 weeks before I met Grace at the gala. My job is data analysis. The relationship doesn't change what the numbers say." Liam leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who'd anticipated this argument and had already decided it wouldn't matter. His next words confirmed Julian's suspicion that this conversation had been over before it started. "And dating the client's CEO makes it look like collusion regardless of timeline. Holloway represents 40% of our revenue. I can't risk that relationship over your personal life. You have a choice, Matthews. Stop seeing Grace Holloway or resign." Julian's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, anger and fear warring for dominance in his chest. This was the leverage he'd worried about, the inevitable moment when his dignity would be tested against practical necessity. Carter's surgery loomed 4 months away, the insurance that would pay for 60% of it tied to this job he was being asked to sacrifice for the crime of falling in love. "You're asking me to choose between my integrity and my job? I'm asking you to understand that some situations require compromise. Your relationship with Holloway creates problems we can't manage. Make it go away or find employment elsewhere." Julian stood without consciously deciding to move, his body already knowing what his mind was still processing. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Liam was asking him to betray either Grace or himself, to prove his loyalty to Morrison and Fletcher by demonstrating he could be controlled through economic pressure. The mathematics were brutal. Staying meant ending things with Grace and living with the knowledge that he'd let other people dictate his personal life. Leaving meant losing the insurance that would save Carter's life, gambling his son's health on the uncertain prospect of finding comparable employment in time. Julian had spent 4 years building a life defined by dignity over convenience, by choosing hard right over easy wrong, by teaching Carter through example that character mattered more than comfort. Walking away from that principle now would corrode something fundamental in who he was. "I quit." Liam's expression shifted from certainty to surprise, the outcome apparently not the one he'd expected despite having forced it. He recovered quickly, professionalism reasserting itself over whatever personal reaction he might have had. "Effective when?" "Immediately. I'll clear my desk by end of day." Julian walked out before his boss could respond, his hands shaking slightly as he processed what he'd just done. The security escort that accompanied him back to his desk felt excessive, but followed protocol for employees who'd just resigned. The company protecting itself against data theft or sabotage from someone who no longer had reason to maintain loyalty. His personal items fit in a single cardboard box. Photos of Carter and Sarah, the coffee mug Miriam had given him when he made senior analyst, the small succulent plant that had somehow survived 4 years of neglect. The other analysts watched with varying degrees of sympathy and relief, understanding that whatever had just happened to Julian Matthews could happen to them if they made similarly poor choices about where to invest their personal lives. The Cobra insurance documentation arrived via email while he was still in the building, the monthly premium of $2,400 glowing on his screen like a death sentence. He had $14,000 in savings and 4 months until Carter's surgery. The math didn't work. The math had never worked. Julian made it to his car before the full weight of what he'd done crashed over him. He'd quit his job to preserve his dignity and quite possibly condemned his son to a medical crisis they couldn't afford to handle properly. The decision that had felt righteous in Liam's office now felt like catastrophic selfishness dressed up as principle. Carter would need surgery regardless of whether Julian had employment. The cardiac center didn't accept nobility as payment. Dr. Reeves wouldn't postpone treatment because Dad had made a stand about integrity over pragmatism. His phone buzzed with a call from Grace, but Julian couldn't bring himself to answer. Couldn't explain yet that he'd just sacrificed their financial stability for the right to keep seeing her. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't currently destroying his capacity to breathe properly. He drove home on autopilot, his mind running scenarios that all ended with some version of failure. Miriam was waiting with Carter, the neighbor's expression suggesting she could read disaster in his posture before he'd said a single word. "What happened, mijo?" Julian set down the box and pulled Carter into a hug that lasted longer than usual, breathing in the strawberry shampoo scent and trying to anchor himself in what mattered. His son tolerated the extended contact with patient confusion, clearly sensing something wrong but not yet alarmed by it. "Daddy, are you okay?" Julian forced himself to release Carter and manufactured a smile that probably didn't fool anyone but felt necessary anyway. He needed to explain this in terms a 6-year-old could understand without sharing the full catastrophic weight of what unemployment meant for their immediate future. "I made a choice, Star. About work and about Miss Grace. It's going to be hard for a while, but it was the right choice." Carter studied his face with those 2 perceptive eyes, processing the incomplete explanation with visible frustration. But instead of pushing for details, his son delivered one of those observations that cut straight to truth underneath adult complications. "Mommy always said right things cost something. That's how you know they're right." The words Sarah had actually said, preserved in their son's memory and deployed now with perfect timing, made Julian's vision blur. He nodded because speaking would have required more control than he currently possessed, and Carter seemed satisfied that his father had heard him. Miriam stayed after Carter went to bed, sitting at Julian's kitchen table while he explained what had happened, and she listened with the expression of someone who'd lived long enough to know that principles were expensive and sometimes necessary anyway. "How much are you short for the surgery?" Julian had run the numbers obsessively enough to answer without hesitation. 31,000. More if there are complications or if he needs follow-up procedures the insurance classifies as elective. Grace could... No. The response came harder than intended, and Julian immediately softened his tone. "I don't take handouts, Miriam. That's the whole point. The second I let her solve my problems with money is the second I become someone who compromised himself for convenience." His neighbor nodded slowly, understanding even if she didn't entirely agree. She stood to leave but paused at the door, her hand on the frame and her expression carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Pride is important, mijo, but so is your son's life. Make sure you know which one you're actually protecting." Julian sat alone in his apartment after she left, the silence pressing in from all sides. His phone showed 17 missed calls from Grace and a dozen text messages that progressed from concerned to frantic. He needed to call her back, needed to explain what had happened and why, but the conversation felt impossible to start. The text he finally sent was inadequate but honest. "I quit my job today rather than stop seeing you. We need to talk, but I can't yet. Tomorrow?" Her response arrived within seconds. "I didn't know they were going to do that. Julian, I'm so sorry. Come to my office tomorrow, 10 a.m., please." He confirmed without allowing himself to think about what that conversation would entail, then set his phone aside and walked to Carter's room. His son slept with the abandon of childhood, unaware that his father had just made a choice that might cost them everything. Julian sat on the edge of the bed and whispered to the sleeping form, "I don't know if I did the right thing, Star. I chose dignity over security. I chose truth over keeping quiet. But now I don't know how to pay for your surgery, and I'm terrified I made the wrong call." Carter shifted in his sleep, one small hand reaching out to grip Julian's fingers with surprising strength. The contact anchored something in Julian's chest, reminded him that he'd made this choice for a reason, even if the consequences were currently overwhelming. Tomorrow he'd face Grace and whatever came next. Tonight he sat with his son and tried to believe that somehow this would work out. That character still mattered in a world that seemed designed to reward compromise over conviction. Holloway Biomed occupied a glass tower in downtown Portland that made Morrison and Fletcher's building look modest by comparison. The kind of architectural statement that announced success through sheer vertical dominance. Julian had never been inside, had only reviewed their financial data from the comfortable distance of his analyst desk. Standing in the lobby at 9:45, waiting for Grace's assistant to retrieve him, Julian felt profoundly out of place. His suit was the same one he'd worn to the gala, clean but not new, acceptable for Morrison and Fletcher but noticeably cheaper than what everyone else in this building seemed to favor. The elevator ride to the executive floor took longer than it should have, the building's height translating into distance from the ground that felt metaphorical. Grace's office occupied a corner with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of Mount Hood in one direction and the city in the other, the kind of space that communicated power through square footage and light. She stood when he entered, the CEO armor back in place, tailored suit, hair pulled back, the vulnerability she'd shown over pizza with Carter carefully locked away behind professional competence. But her eyes carried exhaustion that makeup couldn't quite hide, and Julian recognized the expression of someone who'd spent the night processing disaster. "I didn't know the board was going to force Morrison and Fletcher to remove you from our account. I found out when you did." Julian believed her because lying would have been pointless, but the timing didn't change the outcome. He sat in the chair across from her desk and tried to find words adequate to explain the situation they'd created through the simple act of caring about each other. "Liam gave me a choice. Stop seeing you or resign. I chose resignation." Grace's composure cracked, her hands gripping the edge of her desk with visible force. When she spoke, her voice carried layers of emotion that suggested she was barely maintaining control. "Julian, your insurance. Carter's surgery. Why would you—" "Because asking me to choose between you and my job was asking me to prove I could be controlled through economic pressure. Because teaching Carter that character matters means actually demonstrating it when the cost is high. Because I have dignity and I deserve respect, and compromising that to keep health insurance would have destroyed something in me that I can't afford to lose." The speech came out more forcefully than intended, Julian's own processing of the choice he'd made spilling over into defensive justification. Grace stood and moved around her desk, dropping into the chair beside his rather than maintaining the power distance of her position. "What do you need? Tell me how to help without insulting your dignity." Julian appreciated that she understood the distinction, but the answer remained unchanged. "I need to figure this out myself. I have 14,000 saved. Cobra is 2,400 a month. Surgery is in 4 months. I need to find work that includes comparable insurance before then. I could hire you. Analytics position, full benefits package, salary that... No. Julian stood, needing distance to maintain his resolve. That would confirm exactly what the board accused me of. Dating the CEO to secure employment. I won't do that to you or to myself. Grace stood as well, frustration evident in every line of her body. Then what? You sacrifice our relationship and your son's health for the principle of not accepting help? I sacrifice nothing. I'm asking for time to solve this on my own terms. They stood facing each other across her office while outside the windows. Portland conducted its business without awareness of the two people trying to navigate impossible choices. Grace's expression cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked like determination mixed with grief. I'm going to fix this. The board doesn't get to destroy people's lives because they're uncomfortable with my personal choices. Julian heard the resolution in her voice and felt alarm spike through his exhaustion. Grace, don't do anything that puts your position at risk. This isn't worth... You quit your job rather than stop seeing me. Don't tell me what risks are worth taking. The response silenced his protest because she was right. He'd made his choice about what mattered, and now she was making hers. Julian moved closer and took her hand, the contact grounding them both in the reality of what they were risking for each other. We do this together. No unilateral decisions that sacrifice one of us to save the other. Grace's fingers tightened around his, and when she looked up at him, her eyes held the kind of vulnerability that took courage to show. I'm terrified I'm going to fail you. Fail Carter. That my resources won't matter because you won't let me use them, and I'll have to watch you struggle when I could have helped. Julian pulled her into an embrace that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with two people who'd found recognition in each other's wounds, trying to believe they could heal together. Then we'll fail together and try again. That's what this is. They stood holding each other in her office while Portland spread out below them, and Julian tried to convince himself that somehow this impossible situation would resolve into something they could both live with. His phone buzzed with a text from Miriam asking about Carter's afternoon pickup, and Julian pulled back to respond. Grace watched him handle the logistics of single parenthood, with an expression he couldn't quite read. When he finished, she spoke with careful precision. I need to hear you say something. For me, not for principle or dignity. Do you want this? Me, Carter's chaos, our completely incompatible economic realities, or are you fighting because someone tried to control you? The question hit harder than expected, forcing Julian to examine motivations he'd been avoiding. He could have walked away after Liam's ultimatum, could have ended things with Grace and kept his job and his insurance and his secure path forward. The fact that he hadn't meant something he needed to name. I want you. I want Carter to have someone who sees him the way you do. I want Sunday mornings and terrible cooking and arguments about who pays for dinner. I want to feel something again beyond just surviving. Grace stepped closer, her hands finding his face with gentleness that felt like permission. Say it again. What? That you want me? Look at me when you say it. Julian held her gaze and delivered the truth that terrified and liberated him in equal measure. I don't want this to be about rebellion or proving a point. I want to love you, Grace Holloway, if you'll let me try. She kissed him then, not the tentative contact they'd shared in his kitchen, but something desperate and certain and weighted with all the complications they were choosing to accept. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Grace rested her forehead against his, while they remembered how to think clearly. We fight for this together. You find work, I handle the board, and we figure out Carter's surgery as a team. Can you accept that? Julian wanted to maintain his boundaries about handling things alone, but recognized that insisting on complete independence would damage what they were trying to build. Partnership meant allowing someone else to carry weight alongside you, trusting them to honor your dignity while offering support. Together. But Grace, I need you to ask before you fix. I need to be part of solutions, not just the beneficiary of your resources. I'll try. Every day I'll try. They left her office separately, maintaining the discretion that seemed pointless now, but felt like small protection against additional scrutiny. Julian drove home through midday traffic and tried to calculate how many weeks of unemployment he could afford before panic became unavoidable. Carter greeted him at the door with a new drawing, this one showing Julian and Grace holding hands while stars rained down around them. The image was hopeful in ways that made Julian's chest ache. Miss Grace called. She said she's coming over after work and she's bringing dinner. Real dinner, not burned pasta. Julian pulled his son into a hug and wondered how he'd gotten lucky enough to have a child who could find joy in the middle of disaster. The bed wasn't big enough for 2 people yet, but maybe it was learning to expand in ways he hadn't expected. Grace arrived at Julian's apartment at 6:30 carrying takeout from a Thai restaurant Carter had mentioned liking and an expression that suggested she'd spent the afternoon assembling strategies. She changed out of her CEO armor into jeans and a simple blouse, the transformation from executive to something approaching accessible happening somewhere between her office and his doorstep. Carter launched himself at her with the enthusiasm of someone who'd decided she belonged in their life and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Julian watched them from the kitchen doorway, his son chattering about the drawing he'd made and Grace listening with the kind of focused attention that couldn't be faked. They ate dinner on the living room floor because Carter insisted it was more fun that way, and Grace agreed before Julian could protest about furniture existing for a reason. The casualness of it felt intentional, Grace working to prove she could adapt to their reality rather than expecting them to elevate to hers. After Carter went to bed, Grace pulled out her laptop and opened a spreadsheet that made Julian's analyst brain recognize the architecture of serious research. She'd compiled a list of pharmaceutical companies, biotech firms, and research institutions within a 50-mile radius, each entry annotated with hiring practices, benefits packages, and timeline estimates for recruitment. I'm not offering you a job, I'm offering information that might help you find one faster. Julian studied the document with growing appreciation for the thoroughness she'd applied to solving a problem that wasn't technically hers. The companies she'd identified were solid prospects, places where his analytical background would translate without requiring complete career reinvention. This is good work, thank you. Grace closed the laptop and turned to face him with the seriousness that preceded difficult conversations. I need to tell you what I'm doing about the board. Garrett Thornwood is the one who pushed for the conflict of interest complaint. He's been trying to force me out since I refused his merger proposal 2 years ago. The name registered from Julian's analysis of Holloway's accounts, one of the board members whose financial patterns had contributed to the discrepancies he'd flagged months ago. The connection clicked into place with uncomfortable clarity. The $2 million in miscellaneous operational costs, it's connected to him. Grace nodded, her expression confirming what Julian had suspected but couldn't prove with the limited data he'd had access to. I went through our books using your initial report as a roadmap. Garrett's been moving money through shell companies, disguising it as legitimate operational expenses. It's sophisticated enough that our internal audits missed it. Julian felt the familiar rush of pattern recognition, his mind already assembling the evidence structure that would be needed to prove embezzlement. But alongside the analytical satisfaction came concern about what Grace was planning to do with this information. If you expose him publicly, you need ironclad evidence. Board members have resources to fight back, and if you're wrong, the liability could destroy Holloway. I'm not wrong, but I need someone who understands data analysis to testify about the patterns, someone whose credibility can't be questioned even if the board tries to discredit them. The implications settled over Julian like weight, the understanding that Grace wasn't asking him to step back while she handled this. She was asking him to step forward into public exposure, to use his skills in service of taking down someone who'd tried to destroy his livelihood. Testifying would make it look like I investigated Garrett because of our relationship. It confirms their narrative about conflict of interest. Grace's hand found his, her grip tight enough to communicate urgency. Or it shows you investigated because you're good at your job, found evidence of fraud, and are willing to speak truth regardless of personal cost. Which story do we want people to believe? Julian understood what she was offering, a chance to reclaim the narrative, to turn his resignation from defeat into principled stand. But the risk remained substantial. Garrett would fight back viciously, would use every resource available to paint Julian as a gold digger who'd manipulated his way into Grace's confidence. This could get ugly, for both of us. Then we get ugly together. I'm done letting people like Garrett control outcomes through intimidation. They sat together on Julian's couch while Carter slept down the hall. Two people planning to take on institutional power with nothing but truth, and the stubborn refusal to accept that might made right. Julian pulled Grace closer, needing the physical contact to anchor what they were about to attempt. We do this carefully. Document everything, build an airtight case, and only go public when we're certain we can win. Grace shifted to face him fully, her expression carrying the vulnerability that she'd learned to show around him. I'm terrified I'm going to fail you. That my resources won't matter because the system protects people like Garrett. That I'll have asked you to risk everything and won't be able to deliver justice. Julian cupped her face with both hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. We can rebuild careers. We can't rebuild integrity once it's compromised. Whatever happens, we do the right thing and live with the consequences. She kissed him with the kind of desperation that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. And Julian responded with everything he had, all the fear and hope and determination that had been building since he'd walked out of Liam's office. When they broke apart, Grace rested her head against his chest, and Julian felt her heartbeat syncing with his own rhythm. Two people trying to believe they were stronger together than either had been alone. The emergency board meeting happened 11 days later, called by Garrett under the pretense of addressing financial irregularities that required immediate attention. Grace had anticipated the move, had prepared for it with the kind of strategic precision that explained how she'd built a pharmaceutical empire before turning 40. Julian received his subpoena to testify 2 days before the meeting, the legal document transforming his involvement from witness to active participant. He spent those 2 days reviewing every piece of evidence Grace had compiled, memorizing patterns and timelines until he could recite them without notes. Carter knew something significant was happening, his 6-year-old emotional radar detecting stress even when Julian tried to hide it. The night before the testimony, his son climbed into bed beside him with a drawing that showed Julian standing in front of a room full of people while stars rained down like approval from above. "Are you fighting bad guys, Daddy?" Julian pulled Carter close and tried to find an explanation that wouldn't terrify a child who'd already lost one parent and didn't need to worry about losing the other to consequences beyond his understanding. "I'm telling the truth about someone who did wrong things. Sometimes that means standing up in front of people and being brave even when it's scary." Carter absorbed this with his characteristic seriousness, then delivered one of those observations that cut through adult complexity to reach fundamental truth. "Mommy said being brave doesn't mean not being scared, it means being scared and doing it anyway." The wisdom Sarah had imparted to their son, preserved and deployed now when Julian needed it most, made his throat close around whatever response he might have offered. He nodded and held Carter tighter, drawing strength from a child who understood courage better than most adults ever would. Grace picked him up at 7 the next morning. The sedan she drove herself rather than using a driver, suggesting she wanted privacy for whatever conversation they needed to have before facing the board. She looked exhausted despite perfect makeup, the evidence of sleepless nights visible in details that professional polish couldn't quite hide. Garrett's going to attack your credibility. He'll suggest you investigated him because I asked you to, that we manufactured evidence to remove a board member who opposed our relationship. Julian had anticipated this strategy because it was the obvious play for someone with Garrett's resources. The defense had to be absolute truth delivered with enough conviction that doubts couldn't gain traction. Then I stick to facts. I flagged the discrepancies in February 2 weeks before meeting you. Morrison and Fletcher has documentation of my initial report. The timeline proves I wasn't investigating on your behalf. Grace gripped the steering wheel hard enough that her knuckles showed white against darker skin. What if the timeline isn't enough? What if they decide to protect Garrett because board stability matters more than truth? Julian reached across the console and covered her hand with his, grounding them both in physical contact that reminded them why this mattered beyond corporate politics. Then we know we tried. We don't control outcomes, Grace. We only control whether we speak truth when silence would be easier. The boardroom at Holloway Biomed occupied the top floor of their downtown tower, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views that made Julian's former office look claustrophobic by comparison. 12 board members sat around a conference table designed to intimidate through sheer size, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile depending on their allegiances. Garrett Thornwood sat 3 seats from the head of the table, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who'd spent years navigating corporate politics and believed he'd already won this particular battle. He was older than Julian had expected, mid-50s with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that announced status through subtle details. Grace took her position at the head of the table with the authority of someone who'd earned her seat through competence rather than inheritance, though Julian knew her father's legacy still shadowed every decision she made. She opened the meeting with clinical precision, laying out the evidence of financial irregularities without naming Garrett directly. The moment she finished, Garrett leaned forward with the expression of someone preparing to deploy a weapon he'd been saving. Before we discuss these allegations, we need to address the elephant in the room. Ms. Holloway's relationship with the analyst who supposedly discovered these discrepancies creates obvious credibility issues. How do we know this isn't manufactured evidence designed to remove board members who opposed her personal choices? The accusation landed exactly as intended, planting doubt before Julian could even present his findings. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, their body language suggesting Garrett's strategy was working. Grace remained calm, her training as CEO allowing her to absorb attacks without visible reaction. Mr. Matthews flagged these irregularities in February, documented in Morrison and Fletcher's official audit report. Our relationship began in March. The timeline speaks for itself. Does it? Or does it simply prove that Ms. Holloway cultivated a relationship with someone who could provide convenient evidence when needed? Julian stood before anyone could stop him, the movement drawing all attention to his position at the side of the room where witnesses were meant to wait silently until called. Garrett's expression flickered with surprise but recovered quickly, clearly not expecting direct confrontation. You're questioning my professional integrity based on speculation. Let me be clear about what actually happened. Julian's voice carried the steadiness he'd cultivated through years of presenting data to executives who looked for any excuse to dismiss inconvenient findings. He moved to the presentation screen and pulled up the first slide of evidence he'd prepared with Grace's help. February 14th, I submitted a report to Morrison and Fletcher documenting $2 million in irregularities within Holloway Biomed's operational expenses. The report exists in Morrison and Fletcher's secure database with timestamps that can't be altered. I had never met Ms. Holloway at that point, had no knowledge of her personal life, and was simply doing the job I was hired to do. He advanced to the next slide, showing the shell company transactions that connected to Garrett's offshore accounts. The pattern was elegant in its complexity, the kind of embezzlement that required both financial sophistication and belief that no one would look closely enough to see it. These transactions follow a consistent pattern. Money moves from Holloway Biomed to a company called Meridian Solutions, which exists only on paper. From there, it's distributed to 4 additional shell companies before finally landing in accounts controlled by Mr. Thornwood. The timing correlates perfectly with quarterly reports, always happening within 48 hours of financial data becoming available. Garrett's composure cracked slightly, enough for Julian to register the shift from confidence to concern. "This is absurd. You're accusing me of embezzlement based on circumstantial patterns and your girlfriend's desire to remove me from the board." Julian felt anger spike through his professional detachment, but channeled it into emphasis rather than losing control. "I quit my job at Morrison and Fletcher rather than stop investigating these irregularities. I lost my health insurance and put my son's medical care at risk because maintaining my integrity mattered more than keeping employment. Ask yourself what I gain by fabricating evidence." The question hung in the air, forcing board members to confront the logic Garrett had tried to obscure through personal attacks. A woman 3 seats down from Garrett leaned forward with an expression that suggested Julian's reasoning had landed. "Mr. Matthews raises a valid point. What motivation would he have for manufacturing evidence if it cost him his livelihood?" Garrett shifted tactics with the smooth adaptation of someone experienced in corporate warfare. Perhaps Ms. Holloway promised him employment in exchange for this testimony. A convenient arrangement that benefits both of them while removing obstacles to her control of this company. Julian turned to face Garrett directly, abandoning the presentation screen to deliver his response, without the buffer of visual aids. "I turned down Ms. Holloway's offer of employment because accepting it would confirm exactly what you're suggesting. I have dignity. I deserve respect. I won't compromise either for convenience, not for you and not for her." The words landed with force Julian hadn't fully intended, his voice carrying conviction that came from weeks of defending his choices against people who thought economic pressure should override principle. Grace's expression from her position at the table showed surprise mixed with something that looked like "If you're so confident in your integrity, Mr. Matthews, why did Morrison and Fletcher ask you to resign?" Julian had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that would expose the pressure tactics companies used to silence inconvenient truth. "They didn't ask me to resign. They gave me a choice. Stop seeing Ms. Holloway or leave. I chose to leave because being told who I could have personal relationships with crossed a line I won't allow anyone to draw." The admission created visible discomfort among several board members, executives who understood exactly the kind of coercion Julian was describing, because they'd likely deployed similar tactics themselves. Garrett seemed to recognize he was losing ground, his next attack more desperate than calculated. "So you admit your relationship with Ms. Holloway compromised your professional judgment?" "I admit that I'm a data analyst who found evidence of fraud and refused to ignore it regardless of personal cost. The relationship didn't compromise my judgment. It clarified what matters when institutions try to silence truth through economic threats." Julian returned to the presentation and methodically walked through every transaction, every shell company, every offshore account that connected to Garrett's financial network. The evidence was comprehensive enough that denying it required either willful blindness or active complicity, and watching the board members' expressions shift from skepticism to concern told him which direction credibility was flowing. When he finished, silence held the room for several seconds before the woman who'd questioned Garrett earlier spoke again. "Mr. Thornwood, do you have explanation for these transactions?" Garrett's composure had deteriorated significantly, his earlier confidence replaced by barely contained fury. "These are legitimate business expenses that Mr. Matthews is misinterpreting through the lens of his personal agenda. Meridian Solutions provides consulting services that don't exist," Grace interrupted with the authority of someone who'd spent weeks verifying every detail. "Meridian Solutions has no employees, no physical address, and no documented consulting work. It exists solely as a vehicle for moving money out of Holloway Biomed and into Mr. Thornwood's control. The board erupted into overlapping conversations, members demanding explanations, while Garrett attempted damage control that was transparently failing. Julian watched the collapse of institutional protection that had shielded Garrett for years. The moment when enough people decided truth mattered more than preserving comfortable lies. The vote to remove Garrett from the board and refer the matter to federal prosecutors passed 9-3, the margin larger than Julian had expected. Garrett stood with barely controlled rage, his final words aimed at Julian with the precision of someone trying to inflict maximum damage. "You think you won? You're using her, Matthews. Sick kid, no money, you're nothing but a gold digger who found a convenient mark." Carter's voice cut through the tension before Julian could respond, his small form appearing in the doorway where Miriam stood with an expression of horror at having let him slip past. "My daddy doesn't use people, he loves people. You don't know the difference." The room fell silent, every board member's attention shifting to the 6-year-old who'd delivered moral judgment with the kind of clarity that adults spent years learning to obscure. Julian moved toward his son, but Carter walked forward with the confidence of someone who'd decided these people needed to understand something important. Daddy quit his job so he could keep seeing Miss Grace because making her happy was more important than being safe. That's what love looks like. You're just mean. Julian scooped Carter up before his son could continue educating a room full of executives about ethics. But the damage to Garrett's position was already complete. Several board members were smiling despite the serious situation, and Grace's expression showed she was fighting tears. She stood from her position at the head of the table and addressed the board with steady voice. "Gentlemen, I'm taking a leave of absence effective immediately. Not because of scandal or pressure, but because this child just demonstrated more leadership than I've shown in years of running this company. Real leadership looks like choosing people over politics, truth over convenience, and love over fear." Julian carried Carter toward the exit while Grace gathered her materials, and Garrett's furious expression followed them out of the boardroom. The elevator ride down felt surreal, the three of them standing together while the building's height translated into distance from the confrontation they'd survived. In the lobby, Carter looked between Julian and Grace with satisfaction. "Did we win?" Grace knelt down to his eye level, her perfectly pressed suit creasing without apparent concern. "We told the truth, and the truth won. That's what matters." "Good, because Daddy needs his job back so we can afford my heart surgery." The casual delivery of information that had been consuming Julian's every thought made both adults freeze. Carter seemed oblivious to the weight of what he'd just said, already moving on to observing the marble floor pattern with scientific interest. Grace stood slowly, her gaze finding Julian's with a question that he wasn't ready to answer in the middle of a corporate lobby. They made it to the parking garage before she verbalized what Carter's comment had revealed. "Heart surgery. When?" Julian leaned against her car and let the exhaustion of the morning catch up with him, the adrenaline that had sustained him through testimony evaporating now that the immediate crisis had passed. 4 months. Congenital defect that's been getting worse. The estimate is $85,000. Insurance covers 60% if I can maintain coverage through Cobra until then. Grace's hand found his face with gentleness that felt like absolution. "Let me help. Not as charity, but as someone who cares what happens to your family." Julian wanted to accept, wanted to let her solve this problem with resources that would make it disappear like morning fog. But maintaining his principles through the board meeting meant maintaining them now when compromise would be easier. "We're not family yet." The distinction mattered even though Julian could see how it hurt her to hear it stated plainly. Grace pulled back slightly, processing the boundary he was drawing even in the middle of crisis. "What do you mean yet?" Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small box he'd been carrying since making a decision 3 days ago. Inside was Sarah's engagement ring, the simple gold band she'd worn for 9 years before cancer made her fingers too thin to hold it. "Sarah told me something before she died. She said when I found someone who loved Carter the way she did, I should give them this." She said love doesn't replace love, it multiplies. He opened the box and held it between them, the ring catching light from the garage's fluorescent fixtures. Grace stared at it with an expression that cycled through shock and understanding and something that looked like terror. Grace Holloway, will you marry me? Will you be Carter's bonus mom? Will you let me love you even though I'm broke and stubborn and completely unable to accept help without a fight? She was crying before he finished, tears streaming down her face in a way that would have horrified her in any professional context. Her hands shook as she took the box from him, studying the ring with reverence that suggested she understood the weight of what he was offering. Yes, but I'm terrified I'm going to fail him. Fail you. I don't know how to be a mother or a wife or any of the things this requires. Julian pulled her close, the ring box pressed between them like a promise neither was quite ready to believe. Then we'll fail together and try again tomorrow. That's what family does. They stood together in a parking garage while above them Grace's former board dismantled what remained of Garrett's influence, and Julian tried to convince himself that somehow they'd figure out how to pay for Carter's surgery, without sacrificing the dignity they'd fought to preserve. The surgery date arrived with the inexorable momentum of medical necessity, scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late May when Portland's weather had finally decided spring was worth committing to. Julian's COBRA coverage would expire in 6 days, the insurance company's bureaucracy indifferent to the timing of cardiac procedures or the financial catastrophe waiting on the other side of that deadline. He'd found consulting work that paid well but didn't offer benefits, the kind of contract employment that bought time without solving fundamental problems. His savings account held $19,000, accumulated through aggressive budgeting and the kind of financial discipline that felt heroic and insufficient in equal measure. Grace had offered money 17 times in various forms, each attempt more creative than the last. Julian had refused 17 times with decreasing patience, until finally she'd stopped asking and simply started planning how to support him through what was coming regardless of whether he'd accept financial help. The cardiac center at Oregon Health and Science University perched on a hill overlooking Portland, the building's architecture suggesting competence through institutional solidity. Julian sat in the pre-op waiting room with Carter's small hand, gripped in his while nurses performed the final checks that stood between his son and the surgery that would either fix his heart or create complications they'd spent months trying not to imagine. Grace arrived 20 minutes before they wheeled Carter back, her presence filling space Julian hadn't realized he'd left for her. She sat on his other side and their hands found each other with the automatic coordination of people who'd learned to communicate through touch when words failed. Carter seemed remarkably calm for someone about to undergo 8 hours of cardiac surgery. His 6-year-old understanding of risk apparently less developed than his parents' catastrophic imagination. He looked between Julian and Grace with an expression that suggested he'd been saving a question. If something goes wrong and I have to go be with Mommy in heaven, will you two be okay? The words landed like physical blows, stealing air from Julian's lungs and making Grace's grip on his hand tighten to the point of pain. He tried to formulate a response that wouldn't be a lie but also wouldn't terrify his son with the honest answer that no, they absolutely would not be okay if Carter died. Grace spoke before Julian could attempt words he didn't have. Nothing's going wrong, sweetheart. You're going to wake up with a fixed heart and be annoying us for the next 70 years. Carter considered this with visible skepticism but seemed willing to accept the reassurance. But if it does go wrong, promise you'll take care of each other. Daddy gets sad alone and Miss Grace forgets to smile when nobody's watching. Julian pulled his son into a hug that probably lasted longer than the nurses waiting to prep him for surgery thought was ideal. He breathed in the strawberry shampoo smell and tried to memorize everything about this moment in case his brain needed to replay it for the rest of his life. Nothing's going wrong, Star, but I promise we'll take care of each other no matter what. They wheeled Carter away at 7:45, his small form disappearing through double doors that separated families from medical intervention. Julian watched until he couldn't see his son anymore, then turned and walked toward the windows that overlooked Portland because looking at Grace would have shattered whatever composure he was barely maintaining. She followed and stood beside him while they watched the city wake up below them. Two people waiting to learn if the child who'd brought them together would survive the procedure meant to save his life. "I can't lose him." Julian's voice came out raw, stripped of the control he usually maintained. "Sarah made me promise to take care of him, and if I fail at this one thing, then everything else was pointless." Grace's arms wrapped around him from behind, her body pressed against his back like she could physically hold him together through force of will. "You're not failing. You got him here. Got him the surgery he needs, kept him safe and loved and happy despite everything you've been through. That's not failure." Julian turned in her embrace and let himself break down for the first time since walking out of Morrison and Fletcher. All the fear and grief and exhaustion he'd been containing spilling over in a waiting room that had witnessed this same scene play out with different families countless times. Grace held him while he cried and didn't offer platitudes or false promises, just presence and the steady reminder that he wasn't alone in this. The 8 hours crawled past with the particular agony of time measured in surgical updates delivered by nurses who'd perfected the art of saying everything while revealing nothing. Carter was stable, the procedure was progressing normally, no complications had developed that required family notification. Julian paced the surgical floor like a caged animal, his body needing movement to burn off anxiety that sitting still would have turned into full panic. Grace matched his restless energy for 3 hours before gently suggesting they needed to eat something. And Julian agreed mostly because arguing required more energy than he possessed. The cafeteria food tasted like nothing, nutrition consumed out of biological necessity rather than any actual hunger. They sat across from each other, pushing food around plates while the weight of waiting pressed down from all sides. Grace's phone buzzed with the 14th message from her office, this one apparently urgent enough that she actually looked at the screen. Her expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something Julian couldn't quite identify. "The board wants me back." Full reinstatement with a public apology for Garrett's behavior and acknowledgement that they failed in their oversight responsibilities. Julian felt something that might have been happiness under different circumstances. Understanding that Grace getting her position back mattered even if he currently couldn't generate appropriate enthusiasm. "That's good. You deserve it. I'm going to say no." The statement arrived without preamble, delivered in the tone Grace used when she'd made decisions she expected people to argue against. Julian set down his fork and studied her face, searching for the reasoning that would explain turning down professional vindication. "Why would you do that?" "Because Carter asked if we'd take care of each other. Because you taught me that family matters more than titles. Because I want to be here for this, not just today, but for bedtime stories and soccer practice and whatever comes next." Julian wanted to argue that she could have both, that accepting her position back didn't mean abandoning them. But the truth was he wanted exactly what she was offering. He wanted Grace present for the messy reality of their lives, wanted her choosing them over corporate success because it proved this was real. "What will you do instead?" "Chief Strategy Officer, same company, 40-hour weeks instead of 80. Enough authority to matter, but not so much that it consumes everything else. I already talked to the board about restructuring my role." She reached across the table and took both his hands, her grip communicating urgency. "I'm choosing this, Julian. Choosing you and Carter and the life we're building. Let me make that choice without fighting me on whether I should preserve my career at your expense." Julian lifted her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles, accepting the gift she was offering, even though his instinct was to protest that she shouldn't have to sacrifice anything for them. "Okay, but if you regret it, I won't. The only thing I regret is taking this long to figure out what actually matters." "Doctor." Reeves emerged from the surgical wing at 4:17 in the afternoon, still wearing scrubs and the kind of exhaustion that 8 hours of cardiac surgery earned. Julian stood so fast his chair scraped against tile with noise that made other waiting families look up in sympathy. Carter's surgery went perfectly. His heart is functioning normally and we don't anticipate any complications. He'll be in recovery for another hour, then you can see him. The relief that flooded Julian's body made his knees weak enough that Grace had to steady him with hands on his shoulders. He managed to thank Dr. Reeves with something approaching coherence before the surgeon left to deliver similar news to other families waiting to learn if their children had survived. Grace pulled him into an embrace that felt like celebration and gratitude and the acknowledgement that they'd just cleared a hurdle that had loomed over them for months. Julian held on and let himself believe that maybe they were going to be okay after all. Carter woke groggy and uncomfortable, but fundamentally himself. His first question upon seeing Julian and Grace together at his bedside, making both adults laugh despite the tears. Did I get a new heart or did they fix the old one? Julian smoothed his son's hair with shaking hands, the physical contact confirming that Carter was real and alive and successfully through the worst of it. They repaired your old one, Star. It's stronger now. Carter absorbed this with visible satisfaction, then turned his attention to Grace with the bluntness that medical sedation apparently amplified. Are you going to marry Daddy now that my heart works right? Grace glanced at Julian for permission before answering, and he gave a slight nod because Carter deserved to know what was happening in his life even when the adults were still figuring out logistics. I am. Your daddy asked me and I said yes. Carter's gap-toothed smile was worth every second of anxiety that had preceded it. Good. My heart was broken and they fixed it. Daddy's heart was broken when Mommy left and you fixed that. We're all fixed now. Julian felt his throat close around words that wanted to emerge but couldn't quite form, the simple poetry of his son's observation hitting harder than any elaborate explanation could have managed. Grace's hand found his under the hospital blanket and squeezed hard enough to communicate that she'd heard it too. They sat together in Carter's recovery room while Portland transitioned from afternoon to evening beyond the windows, and Julian tried to calculate how to pay the portion of the surgery bill that insurance wouldn't cover. The number kept interfering with his ability to appreciate the moment, financial anxiety undermining what should have been pure relief. Grace seemed to sense his distraction, her voice quiet when she spoke. I have a proposal. A real one, not me trying to buy my way into solving your problems. Julian tensed automatically, his default assumption that any financial discussion would end with them arguing about whether accepting help compromised his dignity. But Grace continued before he could mount defensive positions. My father left me a trust fund that I've never touched. It's been sitting in investments for 24 years because I couldn't figure out what would honor his memory properly. I'd like to use it to cover Carter's medical expenses, not as a gift to you, but as a choice about what matters. The offer was more complicated than simple money, carrying layers of meaning about Grace's relationship with her dead father and how she wanted to honor his legacy. Julian understood the weight she was placing on this decision, the significance of choosing to direct resources toward healing rather than hoarding them against future loss. That's not me buying you. That's me investing in the family I want to build with you both. Can you accept that distinction? Julian thought about dignity and pride and all the boundaries he'd defended so fiercely over months of refusing help. Then he thought about Carter sleeping peacefully after successful surgery, about the life they were trying to build together, about whether insisting on handling everything alone was actually strength or just fear dressed in principle. Yes, and thank you. Grace exhaled like she'd been holding her breath, waiting for his answer, relief visible in the way her shoulders dropped from the tension they'd been carrying. You're not compromising yourself by letting people who love you help when it matters. They married 14 months later in Julian's backyard, The space transformed with lights and borrowed chairs and flowers that Miriam had insisted on despite Grace's protest that decorations weren't necessary. 35 people attended, colleagues and neighbors and Carter's friends from school whose parents had watched this unlikely family come together over the previous year. Carter carried the rings with the solemnity of someone who understood the significance of what was happening, his gap-toothed grin making several guests laugh despite the ceremony's formal structure. He'd grown 3 inches since the surgery, his health improving enough that running and jumping and normal childhood activities no longer came with cardiac warnings. Julian stood under an arch that Miriam's nephew had built and watched Grace walk toward him wearing a simple cream dress that managed to look elegant without trying too hard. She'd kept her hair down because Carter had once mentioned he liked it better that way, a small concession that demonstrated how completely she'd integrated their preferences into her choices. The vows they'd written together acknowledged the complications they'd navigated to reach this moment. Julian's grief over Sarah, Grace's fear of loss, the economic disparities they'd had to learn to manage, the child who'd brought them together through wisdom neither adult had possessed. Julian promised to never let Grace buy her way out of hard conversations, to love her with dignity and respect, to teach her through example that family mattered more than any professional success could measure. Grace promised to ask before she fixed, to trust before she controlled, to love Carter not as replacement for his mother but as his own extraordinary self, and to love Julian with every broken piece of her heart that he'd helped her learn to access. They kissed while their friends and family cheered, and Carter announced to anyone who'd listened that he'd told his daddy months ago that Miss Grace was the one for the other side of the bed, proving that 6-year-olds understood love better than adults ever would. The reception featured catered barbecue and Miriam's legendary cake, and Carter's space documentary soundtrack that somehow worked anyway because the people gathered weren't there for perfection, but for celebration of something real. Late in the evening, when most guests had left and cleanup was becoming inevitable, Grace pulled Julian aside to the bedroom that had been his alone for so many years. The king-sized bed had been centered in the room finally, the physical manifestation of making space for someone new, without erasing who'd been there before. "Is this okay? I know Sarah chose this room, decorated it, that she's part of everything here." Julian pulled her close and gestured to the photo on the nightstand that showed Sarah smiling at the camera, her eyes bright with life that cancer hadn't yet stolen. Beside it was Carter's drawing from months ago, the one that showed their family with Sarah rendered in stars above them. "She's part of everything because she helped make Carter and Carter brought you to us. This isn't replacement, Grace, it's expansion. The bed's big enough for all the love that's led us here." They lay down together on a bed that had been too large for one person, but turned out to be exactly right for 2, and Julian felt the particular contentment that came from knowing he'd honored every promise he'd made. He'd kept Carter safe and loved. He'd maintained his dignity through crises that could have broken it. He'd learned to love again without diminishing what he'd loved before. Grace fell asleep with her head on his chest, one hand over his heart like she needed to confirm it was still beating. Julian stayed awake longer, listening to the sounds of Carter's breathing from down the hall and the quiet rhythm of Grace beside him. Through the window he could see stars emerging as Portland's lights dimmed with the late hour. And he thought about Carter's observation that love multiplied rather than divided. The truth of it had seemed impossible when his son first said it. But lying here with a wife he'd never expected to find and a child who'd survived every threat his fragile heart had faced, Julian understood completely. The bed was big enough. The heart was big enough. The life they'd built from broken pieces and stubborn hope was exactly big enough for all of them.